Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, Tim. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we are huge fans of your work, and I've told you this many times. I'll say it again. I'm a huge fan personally as well. So this is the little perks I get to do, interview you in the studio today. And we know you as Tim Sharp, as Dr. Happy, but I think there's no better way for the listener to get to know you from your perspective. So could you please share a little bit about yourself, your work, and your passions?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you the brief version, I suppose, and if you want me to elaborate on anything, just let me know. But I suppose the simplest place to start is my background, which was in clinical psychology. So I started out predominantly as a therapist, and then, but fairly quickly moved into academia and research. So the first part of my career was a clinical academic, I suppose. So I was a therapist, researcher, and lecturer, and that was fantastic. That was very satisfying. I thoroughly enjoyed it, to be honest, and that was pretty much my dream when I was coming up. But then, for a variety of reasons, I changed tack slightly. I guess, to be perfectly honest, I discovered that academia wasn't quite for me for a number of reasons. And so I surprised everyone, including myself, and moved into private practice. And then surprised everyone again by building a very successful and large practice. I discovered a bit of an entrepreneurial gene that I didn't know I had. So that was kind of the second phase of my career as an entrepreneur businessman, I suppose, building a clinical psychology practice. And then I had a slight change again and moved with the very early stages of positive psychology. I got very excited about, and I shifted my practice then, or I built another business then called the Happiness Institute. And that's been my main focus for the last I guess almost 2 decades, focusing on promoting the principles of positive psychology, mostly with organizations, so happiness at work and positive culture at work, but also with schools and other institutions and just the general public. Now, that's still what I do now, but I've scaled back a lot of the business side of things. And most of what I do now, I suppose, is speaking and writing and consulting and, when with the writing, audiobooks and podcasts, etc. So that's mostly what I do now, is still promoting the principles of positive psychology. I'm also an advocate for mental health, and I've spoken about my own experiences with mental ill health. So that's a big part of what I do as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think there's no better way to get to know you rather than the introduction you just gave, because I'm a huge fan of your work. I've been following you for quite some time, but yeah, that was really detailed, and it's really great to hear your journey of how things unfolded and how you got here. So that was really, really awesome. And yeah, I think if listeners are keen to find out more about your work, they can always check out the Happiness Institute. And I know that's a lot of your podcasts are now on Audible. I'm a huge fan of Audible as well. So there's that. And for today, we are talking about happiness because, who else could we talk about happiness with rather than Dr. Happy? So that's what we're here for. And I think the key thing that we really want to talk to you about is habits in the context of happiness, because you write books, audiobooks, and you produce contents on habits for happiness in different contexts, as we know. So we would love to hear your personal definition on habits in the context of happiness.
Well, I guess I'll go back a step. Even before I started writing this Audible series on habits, way back to when I first established a Happiness Institute, I suppose. Back then, I realized pretty quickly, and obviously I'd had a history before that in clinical psychology, which largely involves behavior change, obviously helping people change behaviors and thoughts, etc. So I learned pretty quickly, and I still believe very strongly, and this led to I guess, the motto of the Happiness Institute, which is that achieving happiness requires little more than practicing a few simple disciplines each and every day. And I guess just to explain that a bit further, again, as a clinical psychologist who helped a lot of people with things like depression and anxiety and other forms of mental health, and then a positive psychologist trying to help people build a thriving and flourishing life. What I really believe very much, and I still to this day believe, is that it really comes down to those little things we do each and every day. And so, what a habit is, I suppose, is something. Well, it's not just something we do, but it's something we do repeatedly, consistently over long periods of time, and ideally something we do repeatedly, automatically, without really even thinking about it. I
Yeah.
guess a lot of people are familiar with bad habits,
Yeah.
but this is all about good habits, things that will contribute to a healthy, happy, thriving, flourishing life.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point because I think habit is really generic. But then when you said bad habits versus good habits, then there's definitely a separation there. And we really need to focus on that good habit side of thing, which we'll talk about a little more later down the track. But before we jump into the topic of the day and talk about habits some more, we would actually love to talk to you about what you like because we would love to get to know you. So before we jump into the interview, the main part, we have a fun game for you, which is rapid fire. So 10 things we would love to know about you, some of your recent favorites or something that is your all-time favorite, just the first thing that pops into your mind. So are you ready?
Yeah, am I only allowed one word response to these?
No, you can actually elaborate. Yeah, you could, use name of something or a broader series or something like that, or just something that comes to your mind.
Sure.
Awesome, let's do it. Alrighty. Number one is a recent favorite book.
Well, I'm not going to answer the question directly because, as you can possibly see behind me, I love books and I love reading,
Yep.
and I've read too many to single it down to one. But when you say books, what comes to mind is, well, for me, it's one of the most pleasurable, relaxing, and to some extent, a form of escapism that I find very healthy and helpful for my mental health and well-being.
Yeah, and as you should, especially because of the context of your work, and I feel like that would be something that you spend a lot of your time on. So no surprise there. Number two is a recent favorite movie.
Oh well, look again. It's difficult, but I will say one only because it comes in a broader context, I suppose. And it might sound a bit funny because it's not a very serious movie. But I recently saw the latest Spider-Man movie, which might sound a bit surprising for some
I love
people.
it.
But what it means to me, I suppose, is the whole Marvel series, and what that means to me is a very strong connection with my son. My
Mm,
son was just at the perfect age when the Iron Man series and then the Marvel series started to develop, I guess
yeah,
10, 15 years ago. So for
yeah,
me, I've really enjoyed them, but it also for me means, I've grown up as a father watching these with my son. So for me, it really means this connection with my son, I suppose. So
yeah.
it's fun, but it's also meaningful in that way.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And the Spider-Man movie, the most recent one, that's just really well done. I'm a huge fan of Marvel as well, so agree
Yeah,
with you on
yeah.
that. Number three is a recent favorite podcast.
Well, look again. I listen to so many. I actually listen to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks as well. I don't know if I say a specific one, but I guess just generally, I do love the TED Talks. There's the TED Hour and the 15-minute ones. I can't remember what they call them. But again, it's a bit of an obvious one. But there's just so many great people talking about great topics.
Yeah,
Inspirational, educational. So
absolutely.
that's almost certainly one of my faves.
Yeah, I think the one that you talk about was probably TED Talks Daily. I think
TED
I
Talks
also
daily.
love
Yeah.
that one. Yeah, it's amazing. Number four is a recent favorite documentary.
It's actually been a lot that, again, I love documentaries. One of my top strengths is a love of learning. So I do love documentaries. And I did actually watch a really fascinating one recently. Well, again, there's been so many,
Yeah.
but I did watch a fascinating one recently, which I don't know if I got this 100% correct, but it's called 14 Peaks. And it was about a Tibetan guy who, so there's 14 mountains, mostly in India, Nepal, and Pakistan. Actually,
Yeah.
and I think one was in China, that are all above 8,000 meters. So I'm not a mountain climber, but for mountain climbers, this is like the holy grail. And I think there's only been one person that's climbed all 14, and that was sort of 20 years ago, and it took him like 10 or 15
Wow.
years. But this
Yeah.
one guy in this documentary did it all within a 12-month period,
That's
which
insane.
apparently is just phenomenal. Like no one could really
Yeah.
believe that he did it. And again, even I mean, I do love bushwalking, but even as someone that doesn't mountain climb, it was just a fascinating story of diligence, of planning, of preparation, and inspiration. Again, everyone told him he couldn't do it, but he set his mind to it, and he's a pretty remarkable man actually. So it was good fun.
Yeah. Wow. I would have to check it out. That sounds really fascinating. Number 5 is your famous role model.
Now, again, I hope I'm not being too difficult, but I'm not going to answer the question directly because I'm not a big fan of famous people role models. And that's because having worked a lot of my career as a therapist and then as an executive coach, I actually worked with and continue to some extent to work with some quote unquote famous people, a lot of successful businessmen. I've worked with Olympic athletes, professional sports people, some musicians, etc. And I mean, I've loved that. It's been thoroughly interesting. But what I've learned is that you never really when we see the public side of a famous person, we really don't know that much about them. So I've always been a bit hesitant of sort of worshipping or being a fan of famous people because I genuinely believe I don't really know that person. So
Yeah.
my answer to that question would not necessarily be someone famous, but someone, and I hope this doesn't sound too corny, but would be my wife if I'm talking about a role model.
Aw,
Yeah,
I
so
love that. That's so
sorry
sweet.
about the cheese, but I say that because she lives and breathes some of the characteristics of a good life that I would love to be better at. She's
Mhm.
loving, she's compassionate, she's generous, she's kind, she's caring, and she does it all. She excels in all of those things. So I guess I would try to emulate her in some of those areas.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, and I think she'd be really, really happy to hear this part, especially of the podcast when it's released. Um, cool. Number 6 is your favorite app.
Now again, that's a difficult one. I know when you sent through this list beforehand, and I saw that. Now again, it was hard to single it down to one. I suppose. I guess what I came up with, and again, there's many apps. I use my smartphone and use my laptop, regularly, obviously on hours and hours every day, and multiple apps involved in that. But I guess sorry, I guess if I had to come up with one, it would probably be the podcast app. Because again, I listen to numerous podcasts. Most days, I listen to at least one, if not more. And
Yeah.
again, I just think it's a wonderful source of education, inspiration, sometimes even humor, etc. So yeah, that would probably be my favorite one.
Ah, that's amazing. Alrighty. Number 7 is your favorite news website.
Now, I'll preface this by saying I have a love-hate relationship with news. I
I agree.
do, I do love to know what's going on, and I love to keep up to date with current affairs. But to be honest, I also find it pretty bloody depressing at times. So, so I'm constantly torn between reading and checking in and finding out that stuff, and then just finding it so that it makes me irritable and distressed, stressed, and even angry sometimes. But that being said, it would probably be the Sydney Morning Herald would be the one that I sort of check the most. Sometimes the ABC as well. So.
Yep. Sounds great. Number 8 is your favorite artist.
Now, I took the word artist fairly broadly there, so I'm assuming you don't just mean painters and visual artists, although
Yep.
I've got a couple of
Not
them
at
I
all.
could name. But again, it's very. I always hate these ones where I've got to limit it down to one because there's so many artists I've enjoyed over the years,
Yeah.
and particularly musicians. I love music. Live music's been one of my passions for all my life really, and I'll probably again at the risk of I had to leave out all the many who've inspired and entertained me over the years. But I'd probably go back to possibly my first ever love, which was David Bowie.
Mm.
And I say that even though I don't listen to him or his music that much anymore, he still holds I guess a place dear in my heart because he was the first real musician that I discovered. I suppose before that, I guess I just listened to sort of pop, top 40 sort of stuff. And I
Yeah.
also, and I think I learned a lot from him. I think I discovered him at a fairly formative stage in my early teens um, when I was trying to work out how I was. And I guess when I saw him and the many versions of him, it made me understand that it's okay to be different and it's okay to change and evolve, and that you can, if for people that aren't familiar, Bowie's stage persona has changed multiple times over the years. He's had these different characters, quite different characters. So I guess again that was pretty important for me to understand that you don't just have to be the same thing. You don't just have to be quote unquote normal. That evolution and change and being different versions of you is actually possible and recommended, I suppose.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. I haven't really listened to David Bowie, so I have to do that.
That's right.
Um, Number 9 is a favorite course you have completed.
Well, again, I've done so many. One of my top strengths is a love of learning. So I've studied and done multiple courses. I've completed 3 degrees. But again, if I had to sort of name one, it would probably be my clinical master's degree, the second degree I did. And that's because it was the first time I really felt I knew what I could be professionally. I sort of hinted at this in the previous answer. I was pretty lost as a young person, like a lot of people. I didn't really go all through school. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. When we finished, I'm in Sydney, so our HSC, year 12, I had no idea what I wanted to be. Some of my friends did. I had no idea at all. And I only chose psychology because it was the only thing that sort of vaguely interested me. And I guess when I looked at all the other options, it was pretty easy to say no, 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 no.
Yeah.
No to law, no to business. None of those things really interested me. So I was lucky enough to fall into psychology, but it still took me a while. And even all through my undergrad degree and my honours year, even I still had no idea what I wanted to do. But to cut a long story short, I was lucky enough that someone suggested I consider the clinical master's degree at the end of my fourth year, which I did. And it was one of the best, well, possibly the best decision I've made in my life, particularly in my professional life, because as soon as I started studying that, I just loved it. And I knew that
Yeah.
this is, for the first time in my life, I thought, I could actually do something that I could be good at and enjoy. And that was a real life changer. So even though I went on to do a PhD, which I loved as well, that was a real turning point. So that was probably that still, again, holds a very special place.
That's beautiful. I know that a lot of people nowadays still don't enjoy what they're studying. So to hear that you did a degree that you really, really enjoyed is really inspiring. So, hopefully everyone can find that for themselves.
Mm.
And finally, we have a recent event you have attended.
Well, I haven't attended many events in recent years because, as you might know, there's been this thing called COVID that's stuffed up a lot of
If
events.
you haven't noticed already, there's COVID.
So that's a bit of a tricky one to answer because there's
Yeah.
been, not that much going on.
Yeah. Any online events or any, family events you've been to that was
Well,
really
I suppose
beautiful?
maybe, sorry, at the risk of contradicting, I'll go back to, I think it was around June last year, so 2021. So when, again, I guess there's people from all over the place listening, but again, I'm in Sydney. So we had, different stages of lockdown, different stages of restrictions. And as I hinted at earlier, one of my loves is actually music and live music. So I
Yeah.
had a whole lot of gigs I booked tickets to that were all cancelled. But there was this little window, and I think it was around the middle of the year. I can't remember exactly when things sort of opened up again. And my wife and I did actually get out to one or two live gigs, which both happened to be at the Enmore Theatre. And so, and that was wonderful. There was this brief sort of glimmer of hope and fun
Yeah.
that didn't
Yeah.
last very long. But
Oh,
I do
yeah.
remember that, and hopefully we'll get back to that soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully 2022 is the year full of gigs. I'm hoping the same, hoping all my tickets will not get canceled or
Yeah.
rescheduled. So I hear you on that. Alrighty. So hopefully listeners know you a little bit better now as a human. And before we go to the next bit, I just want to say that a lot of the things that you said you couldn't pinpoint one thing, and I think that's really beautiful because sometimes when I go through these rapid fire questions myself, I'm like, I have to pick one thing now, and then later I'm like, but I actually like so much more than that. So it's a bit different to actually have a spectrum of things that you love. So there's that. That's you. And now let's talk about a practice that you do in the context of today's topic of happiness, of habits. The first thing we would love to hear from you is what is a practice that you do to cultivate habits in the context of happiness?
Well, there's actually many, and again, to go back to that point, I don't ever think there's one thing that will lead to
Yeah.
happiness. There's no secret, there's no magic bullet. And look, to be honest, even if there was one thing for me, it would be a different thing for you and a different thing for everyone out there. So I will give you an example, but I'll preface it by saying that everyone needs to find their own version of this, because again, we're all different people, so, and we have different needs, and but also, what I recommend is not just one thing, not just focus, putting all your eggs in one basket, but it's more about building it's like a recipe, I suppose, and building the right combination of ingredients that work for you. But that
Yeah.
being said, one of the most important things for me is actually exercise.
Mm.
Most people think of exercise for the physical benefits, and obviously it does have physical benefits for aerobic fitness and strength and flexibility, which are all good, obviously. But what a lot of people don't realize is that exercise is also fantastic for our mental health, not just our physical health.
Yeah.
It's a stress
Absolutely.
buster. It's an antidepressant. So that's definitely something that I do pretty much every day. And for me, as I said, although there are physical benefits, it's just as much, if not more, for the psychological benefits.
Yeah. That's absolutely amazing and correct because I have been experimenting with exercising in the past year as well, especially in the context of what we're going through. And I think that is such a good habit to build, even if it's just a walk, at
Mm.
least a walk a day, that helps. So I know you already mentioned that there's the physical benefit and there's the the physical and mental benefit. Lost my words there for a bit. But if you were to list some other good things about this practice, what are the top three, would you say?
Well, again, at the risk of repeating it, again, there are multiple physical benefits. But it's one of the best and cheapest things that we can do. I mean, you can spend a lot of money on exercise. There's all sorts of equipment and gym memberships, but you don't have to. And in fact, I don't really anymore. So I used to go to the gym regularly, but I stopped with COVID, and so now I exercise at home. And although, I mean, I won't mention the brand, but I do pay a subscription for one of the apps, the fitness apps, but you don't even have to do that. So it can, money doesn't have to be an object. If you've got money, you can spend it on lots of cool things. But the benefits are immeasurable. And again, it will help you not just be healthier and happier, but live longer. And one of the other things I guess I don't get this as much anymore since I stopped going to the gym, but one of the other things that a lot of people do gain from exercise is the social interaction. A lot of people do, and there's a lot of benefits to exercising in groups. A lot of those small group programs or classes, and they're fantastic because we know that exercise is really good, but we also know social interaction is very good for our physical and mental health and well-being. So if you combine them, and you've
Mm,
got physical exercise that also has mental health benefits, and you're quote unquote socializing or interacting with friends
yeah.
or colleagues or a personal trainer, that has massive, massive benefits as well. And we know that again, it's possibly one of the best things we can do for every area of wellness and well-being.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's not something that people talk about very often because most of the time it's kind of like, oh, you have to exercise. It's just a must. But why? It's actually good in those senses. And I think for me, what I've been reflecting on as well is recently I've actually grabbed a friend and we go on runs and jogs and just have a nice walk together in the morning, and I think that's just really beneficial. And again, it goes back to your mental health, but highly recommend, for people that haven't really tried it, especially when exercising by yourself can feel not that motivating.
Well, that's the other thing. If we know that with any habit, but let's just say with exercise in this context, if you make it fun and enjoyable, you're more likely to do it. If you're more likely to do it, you're more likely to get the benefit. So this is why exercising with a friend or with a buddy have massive benefits, because again, it makes it more enjoyable. So you're more likely to do it, more likely to benefit. This is why a lot of people listen to music when they're walking or exercising because it makes it more fun. And if it's more fun, you do it more, etc. So yeah, making anything, we're going to talk about habits. Any habit that you want to develop, if you can find a way to make it fun and enjoyable, that's a winner.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that we touched on this a little bit, but to you, what are some of the challenges when you practice exercising? And I think you said every day.
Yeah, well, to be honest, there's not that many challenges anymore because I've been doing it for quite a while now on a regular basis. So it's pretty much just something I do. I don't really even think about it. It's just what I do pretty much
Yeah,
every morning. So it isn't that difficult for me. And again, even more so now that I'm doing it at home, it's
yeah,
really easy. So I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to depend on anyone else. But I
yeah.
guess if I go back, there was a challenge when COVID hit, and maybe this, because I did have a really good practice, regular practice at the gym, and I had a personal trainer who I really liked. He'd become a good friend, basically. And even beyond that, there was a bit of a community at the gym because I went mostly at roughly the same time. You'd see the same sorts of people, and we weren't best buddies or anything, but you'd smile at someone, you'd nod at someone, you'd have a little chat. So there was a sort of a really nice feeling, and I did actually have a sense of loss almost when I stopped going. There was a bit of a sort of, I guess, a mild grief reaction, you might call it.
Yeah.
And it also took a while, I suppose, to find my groove in a different area. So that was interesting, and it did take. I did learn a bit from that about, I guess, adapting and modifying and trying new things. And it did take me a little bit of a while to find a different form of exercise that I enjoyed and felt comfortable with. And I guess, so coming back to your question, I suppose, then trial and error is just a great thing. If you're
Yeah.
starting something new or having to change something and you're not sure what to do, just try out different things. That's what I did when I stopped going to the gym, and I tried out a couple of different apps and a couple of different forms or styles of exercise until I found the ones that I'm now pretty comfortable and happy with.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. And I think, especially for people that are still struggling to get into exercising or getting back into exercising after all the changes recently, definitely try different things, like you said. I know that you mentioned you do this every day now. It's just something that you do. You don't really think about it. But because of COVID, given the current situation, how do you make time for it? Do you still set up the same time as before, the pandemic, or do you actually, flexible, flexibly make it around your schedule?
When it's different to what it was before, partly because I've been mostly working from home for the last 2 years, I guess. So that's a little bit different in terms of the time and in that regard. But no, look. So I pretty much, well, I don't have to make time for it because it's pretty much one of the first things that goes. It's just automatically one of the first things I do every morning. So it's not like I have to fit that in. It's that everything else fits in around that. Now, I say that fully aware that I'm fairly lucky or privileged in the sense that I'm self-employed. So I've got, probably a larger degree of control over my time than maybe a lot of people have. But when I was working more in the office and when I was busier in that regard, I still made it a priority. And I guess that's what I'd encourage people to do. Um, Again, everyone's different, so they're right, and everyone will have different times. I mean, I prefer to do it pretty much first thing in the morning. Some people prefer in the afternoons or evenings. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what works for you. But once you've worked out the sort of exercise you want, the time that works best for you, make it a priority. Put it in your calendar, put it in your diary, put it in whatever system you use to organize your stuff, and then fit the other things around it. Because if you don't, it just won't get done. Most people will probably know that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think there was a time that I was experimenting, like you were saying as well, sometimes first thing in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes in the evening. But then I realized that, like you said, just first thing in the morning, for me at least, it works really well because you start your morning perfectly and then you go and you do your things. Alrighty. So, who would you recommend this practice to?
Uh, well, at the risk of contradicting what I said earlier about saying we're all different and we all need different things, I would say pretty much everyone. Um,
Yeah.
there really is. It's hard to imagine anyone for whom exercise wouldn't have some benefits. The caveat to that is different people will enjoy different forms of exercise, and different people will have different goals around different exercise. I mean, my goals have changed quite a bit actually around exercise. A couple of years ago, I was my main focus was on strength. I was lifting really heavy weights. I was trying to build up big bulk, etc. Now it's very different for different reasons. Some people want to run marathons or triathlons or ride big bike trips. Some people want to do yoga or Pilates to have more flexibility and integrate aspects of mindfulness. There's no right or wrongs. Well, I don't think there's any right or wrongs. It really depends what your goals are. What do you want to get out of it? I mean, my main goal for exercising, for example, is so I've got the energy and strength to live life. I don't necessarily have a goal to run a marathon or anything like that.
Yeah.
My goal, and I'm supposed to go back when it started more seriously. I'd always sort of exercised on and off, but when I got really serious about it was when my kids were little, and I wanted to be able to play with them and muck around with them and run around with them and not be an old man, an old dad.
Yeah.
That's changed a bit, obviously, as they've grown up. But that was my motivation, and I guess this is the key. One of the answers is everyone needs to find their own motivation.
Yeah.
Once you've found that, whether it's to do stuff like that, whether it's to be able to go and live your life, whether it's about to live longer or whatever it might be, there's a form of exercise that will be right for you. And even people that have different, maybe some limitations, physical limitations or financial limitations, again, even walking or even just, there's always something. And I guess I'll finish by saying every little bit counts. So even if you don't think you can do as much as you'd like to do, or for whatever reason there are obstacles in the way, tiny bits still add up. From little things, big things grow. So just do whatever you can with whatever you've got, because even little bits will still have little benefits, and that's better than nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like atomic habits, right? There you go. And based on your experience, do you have other recommendations or another practice you combine with exercising so that you improve your level of happiness?
Well, yeah, look, as I said, that there are lots of them, but one of the other main ones, and certainly something that I do practice regularly, is mindfulness and meditation. So that can actually be integrated with exercise. So I try when I'm exercising to be mindful. I think a lot of people misunderstand mindfulness and they think that it's just sitting in the lotus position, relaxing. Well, that's one type of mindfulness meditation, but you can be mindful doing anything and everything. And in fact, ideally, mindfulness is something we practice sort of all day, every day. When we're
Yeah.
eating, we can eat mindfully. When we're washing the dishes, we can be mindful. And when we're exercising, and so by that I mean when I'm exercising, I try not to think about or worry about anything else. I just try to be in that moment, whatever that exercise is, whatever that movement is. And then I try to take that into other areas of my life as well. Now, it's easier said than done, and I don't get it right all the time, but that's right. We're all imperfect. But yeah, next to exercise, one of the other top ones that I'd recommend is some sort of mindfulness and or meditation practice.
Yeah, I agree. It's really great to combine those two practices. And I do that as well. And I find that when I practice yoga, there's definitely that component of mindfulness. And sometimes they integrate short meditation in the exercise as well. So you're aware of your body and your surroundings and you get some exercise in as well. So, if listeners unsure about which exercise to go for, maybe try that. And, with time, you can combine it with other things and prolong that activity and habit. So there we go. That's the habit. And now we are very excited to talk to you about habits in the context of happiness. Now we're going to go deeper. We're going to go with more insights based on your research. And the first thing that we always ask our guest is your personal definition of happiness because it's such a different thing for different people. So what is happiness to you?
Yeah, look, 100%, and that's a great starting point. It really is important to note that it means different things for different people, and so one of the first things people need to understand is that each and every one of us needs to come up with our own definition, because my definition may not be appropriate to you. With different ages, different cultures, different religious beliefs, different backgrounds, different aspirations, etc. So that is really important, and it's often overlooked. I can, and I will give you a sort of broad definition of happiness, which will broadly apply to most people most of the time. But again, I'll just encourage everyone out there who's listening to think about how does it really apply to you and what does it really mean to you in your life. That being said, again, it will mean mostly the same things to most of us, but I will divide it up into two. I'll sort of divide the definition into two parts. So the first simplest way of understanding happiness is that it's one form of positive emotion. So there's a whole range of positive emotions, including happiness, but there's also joy and satisfaction and pride and contentment, etc., 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 calm. And happiness is one of those positive emotions,
Yep.
a really important one, and well, they're all really important. And it's good to strive towards having as many positive emotions as possible. We won't
Yep.
feel them all the time. No one should expect to be happy all the time, but they're good to have in our lives. So the more, the better to some extent, as long as we're realistic about it. I'm sure we'll come back to that later. So one definition of happiness is that it's a form of positive emotion which adds value to our lives in many ways. But probably the more important definition, and certainly what positive psychology is mostly interested in, positive psychology isn't really the science of happiness. It's really the science of thriving and flourishing, which is the science of living our best possible lives. Now, positive emotions are an important part of that, but so are many other things. And so Happiness in that broader sense, or thriving, flourishing, living our best life, includes positive emotions, but, and this is important, it also includes living a life of meaning and purpose. And
Yeah.
that won't always be fun. That can be hard work sometimes. It also means looking after our physical health and well-being, which, as we said, is about exercise, but also about diet and nutrition and sleep, etc. It's about hope and optimism, but also facing up to the cold hard realities of the day and dealing with them. Real happiness isn't pretending everything's okay. Some things are not okay, but it's about how we deal with that. It's about focusing on solutions for that as
Yeah.
best we can. And it's also not just about me, me, me. I mean, too much of the self help movement, I think, is just about the self.
Yeah.
Now, we do need to take responsibility for our lives. That's important. But real happiness is just as much about our connections, it's about a sense of belonging. We know that the happiest people aren't the most selfish people. They have more and better quality relationships. So it's actually about giving and caring and helping others. In giving we receive, in helping we help ourselves. So there's all of that, and then there are things like identifying and utilizing our strengths. There are things like gratitude and appreciation, and savoring the good things in life. So putting all of that together in that broader definition, including positive emotions, but all those other things as well, will lead to our best possible lives.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I feel like my interpretation of what you just mentioned would be happiness is a journey. It's not necessarily a destination like a lot of people think. And when it comes to happiness, you said that there's a lot more to just yourself, which is a really nice segue into the part where we talk about misconceptions, because we know that a lot of people get it wrong, even though, like we said earlier, this might be a little bit contradictory. Everyone has their own meanings and definitions when it comes to happiness, but there's some misconceptions out there when people think about happiness. So, to you, what are some of the misconceptions that you see the most?
Oh, look, yeah, it's a great question because there are lots of them, and actually, I spend a lot of my time busting missing conceptions.
Yeah.
It's a big
Yeah.
part of what I do. But yeah, so well, we've touched on a couple already. One of the biggest ones is the belief that we should or can be happy all the time, and we can't. It's unrealistic. It'd be inappropriate to be happy all the time. It would actually be problematic in some ways. It's the flip side of that is it's perfectly normal, perfectly healthy at times to feel sad, to be anxious, to get angry. These are normal human emotions. We need them. That's part of our humanity. Now, obviously, we don't want too many of those things. We don't want full blown major depressive disorder or full blown anxiety disorders, although some of us will have those things, many of us. But we do need to accept, and there's a great saying that's been around for a while now, which is that it's okay not to be okay, and that's super important. It's okay to be sad at times. It's okay to be frustrated and angry and all these things. But it's also okay to try to feel good as best we can. So that's one of the bigger myths. We can't be happy all the time. We shouldn't even try to. We just be it'd be just like setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
One of the other big myths that we also just touched on then is the idea that happiness is just about me. I've just got to take care of myself and look after my own needs. Well, it is partly about that. I do think we need to take responsibility for as much of our lives as possible, but we can't control everything. We can't be responsible for everything. And again, as I hinted at a bit earlier, it's not just about me, me, me. I mean, that's selfishness. That's narcissism. That's not what real, genuine, authentic happiness is about. So, in fact, if there was one of the most important contributors to happiness, we know from all the research, and not just happiness, but health and well-being and longevity, is other people. So the positive relationships in our lives, there's the intimate relationships with our
Yeah.
husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, parents, children, but also our friends and our colleagues. These are arguably the most important contributors to happiness and well-being. So that's definitely a myth that needs to be busted. It's not just about
Yeah.
individualism.
Yeah. I feel like there are many, many more to bust, but those are probably the key ones for today. And definitely, I've heard, the same concepts floating around in, conversations about happiness. So hopefully for listeners, this will be a good chance to reevaluate what you've been thinking when it comes to happiness. And we discussed this earlier, and now this is going to be more about habits. because this is what we're here to talk about. And earlier we did mention you wrote books, including audiobooks on habits for happiness. And some of the ones that you've written really popular are habits for action, habits for greatness, and habits for happiness. But now we are focusing on happiness as the context. So, what would you say to be the biggest effect of habits on our happiness?
Well, as I said, I guess if we're assuming we're talking about positive habits or good habits, well, I suppose it can work both ways because if we have bad habits, they can detract from our happiness. So if you're regularly, repeatedly, and mindlessly engaging in things that are detracting from your happiness, then you're going to really struggle. And a lot of us do that. So for example, some of the bad habits that can really distract from our happiness are things like, mindlessly scrolling through social media. Now, I'm not saying that's a terrible thing to do or that you shouldn't do it at all. We all do it to some extent, but we pretty much know from the research that it doesn't add much value to your life. It can be useful in terms of, we can connect with friends through social media. I mean, I've got some friends who don't live in Sydney anymore, or they live all around the world, and that's the only way I can keep in touch with them. So going back to the idea that friendships are important, social media can be a great way to connect and stay in touch with people. But a lot of us don't use social media for that. We use it to scroll and compare ourselves and then feel bad about ourselves. So that's just a really common, simple bad habit, I suppose, or it can be a bad habit that can impact on our health and well-being. Mindless eating can be a bad habit. Uh, Doing stuff too late at night so we don't get enough sleep can be a really bad habit. So there's all sorts of things that can detract from our happiness, and what we need to do is become more mindful of those things so we're more aware of it, and so we can start to reduce them as much as possible. No one will ever totally eliminate all the bad things in their life, all the bad habits. We're human,
Yeah.
we're imperfect, we stuff up, we make mistakes, that's okay. But if we
Yeah.
can minimize them, that's obviously what we want to work towards. And then at the same time, we want to maximize the positive habits. Now, that will be anything that adds real value to your life, anything that adds real quality to your life. So that's, things like connecting on a regular basis with friends, making that a habit that you do, So every week I'm going to call dad, every week I'm going to call, catch up with my friend or whatever, those sorts of things, which some people find really easy. And if you find that really easy, fantastic. But for some people, it can be take a bit more of an effort, but it's worth that effort. Just like exercising, just like meditation, all of these things that add value to our lives, we want as much as possible to make them automatic, so they just happen and they just continue to add positivity in whatever way they can.
Yeah, I think that's a really great tip because sometimes we discuss bad habits and people say we need to eliminate all the bad habits. But now the way that you're phrasing it is much more nurturing because there will always be bad habits. We get rid of something and then something else pop up because we're at different stages in life. So, maximize the good habits and then just minimize the bad habits. That's a really great tip.
Well, I just think, I mean, it goes to a really important point, which is crucial to real happiness, which is acceptance, self acceptance, and self compassion. And for
Yeah,
me, that means, some people might think this sounds a bit negative, but I think it's just being realistic. We're all imperfect. I
totally.
mean, I guess if I was to ask the question to any or all the listeners out there, does anyone really think they're perfect? If you do, well, I'd be a bit worried, I think. I'd be a bit surprised. But if we accept that, just as human beings, we're imperfect, we make mistakes. And so part of that is we're going to do bad things or wrong things sometimes. Um,
Yep,
but it
absolutely.
doesn't, that's okay. It's part of the beauty of life in a sense. And there's no point beating ourselves up. If striving towards perfection or perfectionism is actually a bad habit, because it's impossible and you'll just be frustrated a lot of the time. So accepting that is far healthier. Minimizing those imperfections is a realistic goal as opposed to eliminating them, and then maximizing the positive ones is also something that's realistic, even if we expect we won't get it right 100% of the time.
Yeah. Again, more great tips for listeners and totally resonate with you on that point. So, when we talk about habit, here's the thing a lot of people kind of group habit and routine together. So, how do we know what is the best habit that fits our lives? And what would be the difference between habit and routine in this context? Should we refer to our habits as our routine, or do we cultivate our habits and separate that from our routine?
Oh, look, I think that they can be seen as they're very similar, I suppose. They're almost like first cousins in a sense. So I
Yeah.
guess I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think what we want to aim towards is just having as many positive contributors to our lives as automatic as possible, so we don't even need to think about them to have the value that they create. So, and I'll give you a really simple example, which I'm pretty sure most, if not all, of your listeners already do, and that's brushing our teeth. Now, we all, I think
We should.
pretty much all of us, will brush our teeth every day. I do it twice a day, morning and evenings. And that's
Yep.
just something that most of us are brought up with. The dental hygiene community did a great job of convincing us, of brainwashing us that this is something we should do. And we should. And so most people do that without even thinking. People don't get up saying, oh, should I brush my teeth today? They just do it.
Yeah.
You do it straight after breakfast or before you go to bed or both or whatever it might be. And that's fantastic because by making it automatic, by making it part of your routine, you get the benefits. What I would encourage people to do is to think about exercise, to think about mindfulness practice, to think about any or all of the things we're talking about and find a way to make them just do it type activities.
Yeah.
Because if you can achieve, so that again, that's kind of what I've got to with my meditation practice, with my exercise, even with catching up with friends, for example, which got a bit more difficult through COVID. I'd actually make a mental note and even schedule it into my to-do list sometimes about keeping in touch, because it did get hard there through COVID. You couldn't actually get out and do things, but I would still schedule in a Zoom chat or a phone chat or whatever it might be. And again, the more those things are automatic, the more they're just integrated into part of your daily, weekly, monthly, yearly routine, the more likely you are to do them and the more likely you are to get the benefits. So, think about brushing your teeth and then add to that list any or all of the things that you would like to make habitual and then work on that.
Yeah. So cultivate more good habits and let them slowly become part of your routine is where we're going. And yeah, I think that is so true because we don't think about brushing our teeth. But when it comes to exercising, most of us, it's safe to say, I think, still kind of feel hesitant. Should I make time for it today? I don't feel so good. But,
Mm.
we don't say, oh, I don't feel so good. I'm not going to brush my teeth today.
Well,
So,
exactly, and so I mean, part of
yeah.
the, I mean, so yes, 100%. I guess to be realistic, though, part of the challenge is that brushing our teeth only takes like 2 minutes,
Yeah.
whereas exercising might be more like half an hour, and some of the other but what I was so it is a little bit more. It's not quite as simple as I might have made out. The
Yeah.
principle's the same, but it might be a bit harder. But what I would say is, if you don't find half an hour today to exercise, then are you prepared to have half an hour or more tomorrow or next week to be sick?
Mm,
Because essentially that's what happened. If you don't make time for healthy habits now,
yeah.
you'll have to make time for unhealthy consequences at some stage in the future. And
Yeah.
so I'd encourage people to, and the other thing is, I guess I'd encourage people to say, if you don't feel you have the time to exercise, and I'm just using exercise, but it could be anything else, then what are you doing with your time? Because we know from the research that many people listening will spend 4 6 hours a day on relatively useless activities staring at screens. Now, again, I'm not saying you shouldn't be on social media. I'm not saying you should never binge watch Netflix or whatever it might be. We all do a bit of those things. But what I would encourage people to say is, how much value does an hour of Netflix or social media scrolling add to your life versus how much value would half an hour of exercising add? And you can do both, but maybe a little bit less of one might create more time for a bit of the other.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's a great way to go about it. It's probably a mindset thing over anything else. Alrighty. So now we talked about habit and routine and building up our habits for our routine. So how do you think that would play in to the next part of talking about a structured life? How should we go about having a structured life and having the discipline to do the things that we want to do? Because a lot of the times this is the biggest hurdle that people will come across. Is not just habits for happiness, but in the broader context, it's hard to have a structured life. And we know that in turn, that will lead to a happier, healthier life. But it's just really hard to follow a structure sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of different issues in there. So I'll try and tease some part of it. One is I am actually a big fan and a strong advocate of habits and a structured life. I think there are many benefits, as we talked about a lot already. If you can do, and I'll just sort of broadly say the good things, whatever they are for you, if
Yeah,
you can identify what's going to add value to your life for your health and happiness and success, and then make them automatic, make them habitual, structure them in. So again, like we've talked about, you just do it, like brushing your teeth, like
yeah,
exercising. There's multiple benefits of that, because again, you if you increase your chances of doing the good things, then you get more good. But I will say that spontaneity and flexibility is also important,
yeah,
and this is probably something that I've got a bit better over the years. I probably wasn't as good at when I was younger. But as much as it's important to have structure and have regular habits, we also need to be able to go with the flow a bit. We need to adapt when things go wrong or when things change, and I think that's really really important. The other bit about discipline is I actually think discipline is overrated. Discipline's really hard, and we don't have to make it that hard for ourselves. As I said, I'll just talk about exercise because again, it's a nice tangible example that we've used before. I don't think I'm disciplined because I exercise every day. Discipline is like, will I do it or not? Yes, I'm going to do it. That means I'm strong. I don't, because I don't even think about it. It doesn't require discipline.
yeah.
And I think that's, when I think back on all the successful people that I've met in all areas of life, again, in business, in sport, in performing arts, whatever, it's not as though they're disciplined. It's just, they just do the important things, and they put those important things at the top of their lists. There's a metaphor that's been used, that's used a lot in the business circles about big rocks. If you
Mm.
want to fill up I don't know if you've heard that one. If you want to fill up a jar
Haven't.
with, say you've got big rocks and smaller rocks and then sand and whatever, you've got to put the big rocks in first. And the big rocks stand for our values, our priorities.
Mm,
Too many people start with the little things because they're easier, but they don't have much impact.
mm.
If you start with the big things, even if you only do a little bit of the big thing, you're going to have much more success. So I'd say that is again, I think that's better than discipline. The other part of that, though, is which might tie into discipline or motivation, depending on how you describe it, is we need to know our why. Again, you need to, why are you exercising? Why do you want to get good sleep? Why are you connecting with family or friends or meditating or practicing? If you don't know the why, then it's always going to be a struggle, and it's always going to be easy to get distracted. But because my why for exercise, for meditation is so strong, it really isn't that hard to do them on a regular basis.
Mm. Yeah, so that's your big rock, find out the why, and that's the first thing you put into the jar. And what I'm kind of understanding from this is that you would put the little rocks in and then they would just fit into the cracks, and similar to the sand as well, right?
Well, they can come later, yeah. I mean, there'll always be little things that we want to have in our lives that aren't necessarily that important. They're not that
Yeah.
significant, and that's fine. But the big significant things need to come first. So when you're scheduling out your day or week or year,
Yeah,
those big things need to be put in, and then you can fit the other things around it. That's fine.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really great way to go about it, I reckon. And yeah, I think when you say discipline is just overrated, I think that is new information to a lot of us, because a lot of the time when we see these talks or articles about, like, if you want to be successful and happy, you got to be really disciplined, and that is a lot of pressure. So
Well, I
you
think
know
so. When I remember back in my clinical psychology days and working with a lot of patients or clients who struggled a lot, and I think sometimes they were called, or people would suggest that they weren't motivated.
mm,
But I learned, and I believed very strongly then, and I still believe now, that everyone is motivated.
yeah.
It's just that we're motivated to do different things, or we're not always motivated to do the right things.
Yeah.
So, and motivation comes from that why. If someone's not exercising, it doesn't necessarily mean they're not motivated. It might just mean they're more motivated to sit on the couch for
Yeah,
whatever reason. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a
yeah,
healthy thing in the long term, but if we reframe motivation and rethink about, again, what's your why?
yeah,
Why do you want to do any of these things? Do you want to live a healthy, happy, successful life? If so, then some of these things we've talked about will contribute to that. If not, well, that's your choice.
yeah. That's really true. So now we've been looking at habits and happiness and going back to happiness, even though we all have different definitions and meanings when it comes to happiness, it often means, it's a lot about the way we look at things. And I know that we can change the way we think about things, and that in turns help us with the way we can change our lives. And it seems like happiness is something that we can choose. And I know that choose is an acronym that you use as a key happiness strategy. So could you please explain more about this and its relation with building healthy and let's just say positive habits?
Yeah, sure. I'll preface this again with a qualifier, which is that we can't choose everything. We don't choose biological or genetic makeup, and to some extent that will have an influence. We can't deny that there is some contribution to our happiness and quality of life, or and our health, that comes from our genetic makeup, that's passed down through our parents and grandparents, etc. And obviously we don't choose that, but it is significant to some extent. It's not 100%, thankfully, so it doesn't make up everything. But and we can't choose our childhood or our childhood experiences. And unfortunately, some people have had unpleasant or distressing or even traumatic childhood experiences, in all, whether they've come from poverty or whether they've had trauma or abuse or whatever. Again, that people didn't choose that, but that will have an influence. So I guess I just want to, I don't believe that any of us choose 100% to live our lives or to be who we are. But that being said, even though we can't choose our genetic makeup, and even though we don't choose history, we can choose to a large extent what we do with it from now.
Yeah.
But that is important. It's not 100%. All of us will have some history, biology, but we've got to work with that. So that's the thing. We choose to work the best we can with whatever we're given and whatever we have. And thankfully, that choice is still significant enough to make a real difference. So again, even if it's not 100%, we do know from the research that the choices we have, the choices we can make each and every day, have enough of an impact to make a real difference, and that's great. So, but again, I do want to qualify that there are other factors, some factors that are beyond our control that we didn't choose and we can't change, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, so but that being said, if we accept the fact that we do have some choice and that some choice is influential or significant, then I think that's what we should focus on, because one of the things we know about happy people is that they focus more on what they can control and they worry a bit less about what they can't control. So
Mm,
if there's something in my genetic makeup I can't change, it doesn't really help to worry about it. It
yeah.
doesn't really achieve anything. Or if something happened to me as a child, again, I can't go back and change that. So although it still might influence me and it still might be part of who I am, spending too much time thinking about that isn't necessarily going to be helpful. So, what's more helpful is thinking about or choosing what we do with our lives, the habits we develop. What we can think about, what we can choose is the attitude we take, as you said, the way we think about things. At the risk of oversimplifying, we can't always control or determine what happens to us, but we can choose how we think about what happens to us.
Mm,
Now, again, like a lot of these things, that's much easier said than done. I know that better than anyone. In
yeah.
fact, it's very difficult at times, but it is possible. We've got bucket loads of research from clinical psychology, from coaching psychology, from positive psychology, that people can become more aware of their thoughts, and they can, if they work on it, change their thoughts. They can change their attitude and beliefs and expectations, all of that stuff that psychologists call cognition, all the stuff that happens in here. And we know that if we change them towards more helpful thoughts, then that can make a massive difference. Now, again, I say more helpful, not necessarily positive. So I don't advocate positive thinking, but what I encourage people to work towards as best they can is helpful and constructive thinking,
Mm,
things that will lead towards a better outcome, however you define that. And again, that's a skill, and like any other skill, the more we practice it, the better we get. The better we get, the more benefits we get. So, yeah, that's a very important part of happiness and health and well-being.
yeah. I think it's interesting how we always have a choice, even though, like you said, we cannot choose everything. We often forget about the choices that are there for us. And it's just a good reminder because a lot of people think that, and this probably goes back to the mindset side of thing, fixed mindset and growth mindset. A lot of people think, yeah, because I'm like this, there's no other choice. There's nothing else I can do. But actually, there are things that you can choose to do given what you know, what has been happening with you. And I think the strategies, the little things that you just recommended would be really helpful for anyone who thinks that they don't have a choice, because we always do.
Well, 100%. That idea of choosing how we think is inherently what growth mindset is about. So, for those people that aren't familiar with that idea, a growth mindset is the belief that I'm not just something, but it's not that I was born this and this is who I will always be. The growth mindset is, well, this is who I am, but I can become something different or better or whatever. Um, Believing that is inherently important. But at the same time, one of the, and coming back to the myths and misconceptions, the idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, one of the greatest misunderstandings or misuses of that whole body of research is to think about it in dichotomous terms, that you're either one or the other. And that's not necessarily true. We're all a bit of both. We all have a bit of a growth mindset at times and a bit of a fixed mindset at times. And it's the same with like pessimism and optimism, very, very similar concepts. So it's not as though there's no one really that's entirely a pessimist all the time, or even that's entirely an optimist all the time. We're on a dimension or a continuum, and we all sort of go backwards and forwards a bit depending on what's happening or what the issue is. And I think that's important because thinking that, and if I think I'm a pessimist, well, that's a very fixed mindset, and it's unhelpful, but it's also probably untrue
Yeah.
because there'll be times when I'm an optimist and have more of a growth mindset, and just recognizing that can actually be a lot more helpful.
Yeah. Ah, that's beautiful. And we're talking about happiness. We've talked about, your choices, and we've talked about, different people having different views on happiness. We also see that there are happy people. And I know that you've done a lot of research. You're a Dr. Happy. So, according to your research, based on your experience having worked with so many different people, what are some of the characters of happy people?
Yeah, well, look, there are. Well, sorry. Firstly, again, no one's happy all the time.
Yeah.
That's a myth, and even some of the people we might look at, whether they're famous people
Yeah, yeah.
or even as just family or friends, we've got to remember that we never see and we never know everything about that person. So even those seemingly happy people, and there are some people that are happy more of the time,
Yeah.
but they still experience sadness and frustration, and because they're normal humans too. So, but we do know that there's definitely some people who are happier more often and who do find happiness a bit easier. Just like there are some people who find creativity a bit easier, who can sing or paint, or some people who are more athletically talented. So it's just we're born in a certain way, and
Yeah.
but yeah. So when we look at those happier people, there are a number of differentiating factors. So there are some. There's probably some genetic role that they were just born a bit luckier. They probably had fewer adverse childhood events. They're a bit luckier in that regard as well. They're probably also born naturally a bit more optimistic, possibly a bit more sociable, a bit more likable, etc. So there's a bunch of sort of psychological attributes. There are also a number of what we call psychological strengths that
Yeah.
are more likely to be experienced or by these people, and these are things like they're more likely to love and be loving, to love and be loved. So they're more likely to be compassionate and to accept compassion in return. That's something we know is really important. They're more likely to be curious and love learning, which is kind of like that growth mindset, I suppose, in a way. They're more
Yeah.
open minded.
Yeah.
Um, they're much more likely to be appreciative and grateful, which goes back to the point I think I raised a bit earlier, which is that they're more likely to think about what they have and less about what they don't have. But the good news is that we can all practice and develop these things. So even if, again, if you look at the practice of gratitude, for example, we know there are some people who are more naturally grateful, they're more naturally thankful, but we also know that anyone can learn and practice and get better at gratitude. And if they do, they're more likely to be happier.
Yeah.
So, any of those things that we find that tend to be associated with happy people are also things that any other one of us can, if we want to, if we put our mind to it, learn and realize the benefits of.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really great way to go about looking at that, because, like you said, not happy people, but let's look at happier people. And I feel like, when you identify those characteristics, it's really good to see and try to adopt them, with a growth mindset, of course, because if you think that you cannot have any of those things, then that's just a fixed mindset and that won't go anywhere. But yeah, if people look at what happier people do, or what happier people tend to have, then if we strive towards those things, we could all be a little bit happier, whatever that might mean to us, because each of us, again, have different levels of happiness. So that's beautiful. And the final thing we want to touch on with you today is what we're going through right now. We talked about this, right? Not a lot of events happening, life's a bit upside down. You don't really get to catch up with your friends that often because of the pandemic. It's the elephant in the room. We just cannot go about this without addressing that. And everything is changing. Everything feels strange still, even though we've been through this for almost 2 years now. How would you suggest that we can maintain our habits, especially for people that are in isolation or in lockdown during this uncertain time?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say, which you kind of touched on then in the question in a way, is that to accept that things are tough, to accept the
Yeah.
realities. That
Yeah.
there's no point denying it or pretending that it's not. It has been a pretty shitty few years in a lot of ways. No, not entirely. Not everything's been bad. I'm sure we've
Exactly.
all in different ways had some fun and joy and success, etc. But in many many ways, for many many people, it hasn't been the ideal the last 2 years, and in fact, it's been far from it. So, coming back again to the point I mentioned a lot earlier, it's okay not to be okay. If you're feeling frustrated, irritated, grieving, sad, whatever it might be, that's perfectly normal. It's perfectly understandable and appropriate. Uh, the other thing that we can take from that is that as best we can, and this is something I've been encouraging for the last 18 months or 2 years, is that as best you can, it's still helpful to try to practice your healthy habits, whatever they might be. So, for example, I used to go to the gym regularly.
Yeah.
I stopped that because of COVID, but I replaced it with a similar type of habit, a different form of
Mm.
exercise.
Yeah.
And I think that's something, whether it's COVID or anything else, things will change. And we change, we go through different stages of our lives. And so there's a useful lesson there that if things change, if you change, how can you keep up that same habit or keep up a different version of that habit, something that will still contribute in a useful way, given the changing circumstances? Because again, we need to be flexible. Life's always going to change,
Yeah.
or as I said, we're going to change. None of one, no one's the same person. As an 18-year-old leaving school, you become a different person when you're 25, 26, and you're either finishing uni or kind of starting establishing yourself in a career. Then you're in your early 30s and maybe you've got a mortgage or you've got family or kids. And then so at every stage in life, things change, you change financially, personally, interpersonally. And so one of the most important things about not just happiness but maintaining happiness is adaptability and being flexible and continually fine tuning, I suppose.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's what I'd say is keep doing what's helpful as best you can, but also keep adjusting and fine tuning where you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. Adaptability plays such a huge role nowadays, especially as we know, just things just constantly changes and plans just don't stay the same, especially given what we've known in Australia, in particular. That has been quite an interesting thing to navigate. And I guess I actually have this question that just popped into my mind because we are still in the pandemic. We're still, learning to be adaptable and adjust our routines and everything. But then there will be a point where we actually adjust back to normal, whatever that might mean. And, it's just going from, one change to another. And there will be a lot of different things that we need to do to go back to that point when that happens. And that will present as new challenges, right? Because what I've noticed, at least in the past 2 months in Melbourne, is ever since we opened up, people start to want to catch up more. And then the routine that I used to have, or the habits that I used to keep during the lockdown period, was reading every night. That was really important to me. And it gave me so much peace and happiness. But ever since we got out of lockdown, we started replacing that with a lot of social activities. And these social activities, as we know, we cannot really time box them because sometimes they tend to be really, really spontaneous. And I find it a bit hard to adjust because even though you said, you want another version of your habit to be able to keep up what you've been doing. I have been struggling with that. I find it really hard. So, what would be your tips for that?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's something I've thought a lot about and talked a lot about over the last year or two. This idea of returning to normal. What I'd actually say to people is, do you really want to return to normal? Do we
Mm,
have to? Because what I would say is, unless your pre-COVID normal, pre-pandemic, was 100% perfect, why would you want to go back to something if it wasn't perfect? Why don't we? What I'd encourage people to do is find a new normal, a better normal, based on some of the lessons we've learned over the last 18 months or 2 years or so. Because as I said, it hasn't been all bad. Some people have enjoyed quieter time, a slower time, more reading time. And if that's something that you enjoy, fantastic. How can you keep that going, or how can you integrate it into your new life? So coming back to the point I raised a bit earlier, I would say, based on all the good things that you had before, and then all the best things that have happened during COVID. It might sound strange to say it, but there have actually been some good things in the last year or two.
yeah,
I
not at
think a lot
all.
of
That's
people have,
great.
as I said, enjoyed more reading time, or
Yeah.
particularly probably the most common response I've heard from people when I say, what's been the best thing about it? Most people have said they've really come to a greater appreciation of family and friends.
Mm,
When something's taken away, in a sense, you
yeah.
realize how important they. And so what I would say, let's not lose sight of those lessons. Let's not
Yeah.
lose sight of what's really important,
Yeah.
as opposed to what we think is. So how can you then create a new life,
Mm,
as best you can? Again, remembering that we're not perfect, etc., but a new life that still has connection at the top,
yeah.
reading time. That again. So, what are your big rocks? What are those priorities?
Mm,
And how can you make reading time, if not every night, then at least once or twice a week, or whatever works for you. So, I guess that's what I encourage people to do, is to take all the best bits of their previous life and the best bits of their pandemic life, and start to craft a better new life that incorporates as much of that as possible.
mm. Yeah, I think that actually comes with a lot of setting boundaries as well, because in the
Well,
pandemic, it
that's,
was
sorry, yeah,
almost
that's
like yeah.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that I say this a lot, and I'm glad you brought it up, because so one thing that we need to remember is, I think it's really important to say yes to life and to say yes to the good things, but what we also need to do is say no to stuff.
Yeah.
So I think, and I don't think a lot of people give enough thought to that. What do you need to say no to to have enough space so you can then say yes?
Mm, beautiful. Yeah, I think that's what I would definitely apply, given what I've learned from you in this conversation, setting more boundaries, choosing my rocks, and prioritizing them. So there we go. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. It has been really insightful. And now, before we close, we have a couple of fun activities for you to do. The first thing that we would love to do with you is to do a bit of a role switch, because obviously, as I've been interviewing you for the past hour or so, I've learned a lot of new insights from you. And now it's your chance to ask me, throw back questions at me. Could be about what we've discussed, or could be something that we haven't touched on yet about the topic.
Well, I'll start with something that might seem a bit blatantly obvious, but I'll start in. What makes you happy?
Oh, it's a big question. It's not easy to answer. I think I feel happiest when I make my people happy. I feel happiest when I bring joy to my friends and families, and when I create something meaningful. And it could be anything. It could be, a perfect shot of sunset that everyone appreciate, or it could be a piece of calligraphy that means a lot to me, and then people receive it and they take and they internalize the lessons that I learned. So yeah, joy to others and creativity.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, and that touches on a few things we've talked about already. Again, that happiness, it's not a solo sport; it's a team sport. It's about
Yeah,
all the other people, and that making other people happy is one of the best ways to make ourselves happy.
yeah.
You've also touched a bit on another one that it doesn't actually get talked about a lot, but it's actually a really interesting concept in positive psychology, which is the concept of awe. You mentioned a sunset or
Mm,
beautiful art. Awe is this idea of seeing something beautiful that's almost beyond our conception, like, again, like a sunrise or a sunset or whatever. So,
yeah.
yeah, what are some of the things that bring awe to your life?
Yeah, I think you actually just said that, that sunset, because I think what I really appreciate living in Melbourne is there's just a lot of gorgeous sunsets especially during the summer. And every time I see it, I don't ever take it for granted. I have a view of sunset from my apartment, and every time I see it, this is the same feeling. And each day it looks a bit different. Some of the other things would be when I travel and I see something completely different from what I've seen before. It brings so much awe, and it kind of sparks happiness as well. I feel like I was in the moment. I feel in tune with our planet, and it's just great awe.
Fantastic. Oh, thanks for that.
Cool. Alrighty, that really sparked some thoughts about self reflections. I'll do some more thinking about it after today. It was great to hear from you and to have you ask me questions. So now we have open mic for you because we know that you're passionate about happiness. You're Dr. Happy. We've talked about habits for happiness, but I'm sure there are multiple other things you're passionate about, and we would love to open the stage for you today to talk about something different from what we've discussed, something that has been a recent passion of yours.
Sure. Well, there's a couple actually. So we've touched on a few already. Yeah, I've mentioned my love of music, which I love, and my love of reading and learning. But one thing we haven't touched on, I suppose, which is was not a recent. Well, it's something I've loved for a long, long time. But I must admit, I lost touch with it for a bit, and I've really reconnected with it in recent years or so. Is actually bushwalking. Or being in nature. I did a lot of that when I was younger and loved it. A couple of my good friends from starting in high school, I suppose, and then just after. But then I suppose as I got busier in my career and family and stuff, I still did a little bit of it, but I lost touch a bit. But I've really been reconnecting with bushwalking and nature in the last year or so, I suppose, as much as I was allowed to with COVID. And yeah, no, I'm thoroughly enjoying that. So it's re-becoming a big passion, a big part of my life.
Mm. So, what would you say to be the feeling you get when you do bushwalking? And, if people were to try that, what would be the benefits and what would be the best way to go about it?
Well, for me, it's actually wonderful. So for me, it ticks a number of boxes, I suppose. So I mean, I guess one of the more obvious ones is it's a form of exercise. So as I said, I love exercising. I know it's good for me, and it's a different way to get out in the fresh air and exercise. So that's one of the more obvious benefits that if you're walking for 10 kilometers or whatever it is, might be. But there's also much more to that. For me, so I make a point when I'm walking of not checking my phone. Although it is difficult because I like to take photos sometimes.
Yeah,
it's a,
that's true.
but so for me, it's a way of disconnecting from all the crap and clutter that I sometimes get distracted and distressed by,
Yeah.
and just really, and it's a form of mindfulness,
Yeah.
of just being in that moment. Because often, so the walk I went on recently, for example, it was on a track, but it was a relatively rough track. So
Mm.
you have to pay attention or else you fall over. Like
Yeah.
there's loose rocks and you're climbing. So having to pay attention is a good thing. And again, it's like an enforced form of mindfulness. You have to pay attention. And if you're paying attention to the track and the walking, it means for me, my mind doesn't wander onto other crap that can be
Yeah.
upsetting or distress. So it's
Yeah.
a form of exercise, it's a form of mindfulness. It's a connection with nature, which so I'm not a religious person, but that's the closest I get to, I guess, a form of spirituality where I guess it's a love for something bigger and grander than me as an individual. When I see nature, either beautiful bush or even the ocean or whatever, that fills me with awe and inspiration in a way that you described a bit earlier. And for me, I hesitantly say, but that's almost like a spiritual, religious experience for me. It makes me feel wonderful to
Mm.
see the beauty. Yes, I guess it's all of those things rolled up into one without wanting to sort of overanalyze it too much. But yeah, there are multiple benefits, and I find it fantastically helpful.
Mm. Beautiful. That's something new for listeners today. If you haven't tried bushwalking, now's your chance. Multiple benefits. So, Tim, thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely amazing to talk to you. Definitely had a lot of fangirl moments, but we are very, very happy that you went onto the show. So that's our happiness today, and we hope to see a lot of your wonderful work in the future. And once again, thank you for joining the podcast, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
You've been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.